Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, December 3rd, 2025, and our dear brother, Matt Ho, is here with us. Welcome back, Matt.
Hi, Nima. Good to see you.
Let me start, Matt. Please subscribe and hit like buttons, helping us reaching more people. And Matt, let me start with the one of the videos that came out in which we have Elon Carr, the CEO of Israeli American Council, talking about how they can use, what's going on in Israel. They can somehow learn from what's going on in Israel to, to somehow use that sort of strategy in the United States to convince the people in the United States, or maybe fighting people in the United States. Here is what he said. I want to know, what is your take and what is your understanding of these sort of arguments in the United States?
We are living in a time of miracles and unprecedented opportunities. And the challenge for us here, and with this I'll end because this is key. The challenge for us here is to leverage Israel's successes into our successes and our victories here, because we are one people. Israel's weakness is ours and Israel's strength is ours. And now that Israel has turned the entire geopolitical situation on its head, our job in the diaspora is to leverage those wins and win here. Do to our enemies here what Israel did to its enemies there. And on that, the IAC is focused.
That's a good idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow.
What is that, Matt?
Wow. That's, what that is, you can explain it away in terms of that's a segment of the ruling class trying to maintain their status quo, right? And understanding challenges to their authority and their power, challenging to their control of the narrative. You could explain it that way. Or you could also look at it in a sense of these are people who really do believe themselves to be God's chosen people, and that they have a right and a duty to kill those. There's no other way to do it, to kill those to maintain their position. And it's not even about being usurped. It's more about almost like an aspect of mowing the grass, that we have these weeds around us and we have a duty or requirement we need to eradicate them. I mean, that is essentially, I think, what you're dealing with here with in that type of conversation, where I'm not even sure how insecure they actually are, as much as it's just that they're challenged by the affront of being challenged, right? That the temerity, the insolence offered to them has to be responded to. And as well, then this aspect of, we've got to cut the grass. So it's really remarkable what he says in an open forum like that, and how the response from the attendees, of course, were approving. The moderator didn't drop his microphone or say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, hang on, what are you saying here?" Because it's clear what he's talking about. I mean, like anyone, I'm sure they'll try and gaslight that away, or explain it away, or make pretend that we're all idiots. What's the expression? Piss on our legs and tell us it's raining. I'm sure they'll try and do that. Oh, he didn't mean, but there's no other way to understand it.
Matt, we had Benjamin Netanyahu asking the president of Israel to pardon him. And the response from the president and maybe the oppositions in Israel was that he has to retire from politics. One of the conditions they put out. The second was the investigation of October the 7th. How do you see the whole situation? On the other hand, we had hundreds of retired police officers in Israel asking the president of Israel to reject Netanyahu's pardon request. What is your understanding of what's going on with Netanyahu in Israel? And is this guy capable of being retired from his position, or he's going to continue until the end? I don't know what that would mean, the end, but how do you see this?
Again, I think you could look at this in a general context and understand Israel to be a mirror of the United States in its terms of its corruption, in the terms of its entitlement of its ruling class. Uh, Certainly, we can understand the fractures and friction and division in Israeli politics, division that's long been there, but seems to have been exasperated and polarized by the excesses of Israel's policies, particularly when it comes to the colonization of the West Bank, the apartheid against the Palestinians, its desire to pursue dominance through the region by just bombing their neighbors and assassinating the neighboring countries' leadership. And that type of excess is going to come back home, right? The chickens are going to come home to roost. And you could say that the same thing about the United States. A guy like Spencer Ackerman has written a great book, explaining how we get Donald Trump because of the global war on terror. You can explain how the excesses here, how the decisions made by both Democratic and Republican administrations leads to a reality, a zeitgeist, a culture in the United States in which someone like Donald Trump rises to the top. When you abandon all pretense about the rule of law, if you abandon, whether it's internationally or nationally, someone like Donald Trump is going to rise to the top. And in Benjamin Netanyahu's case, he's not new like Donald Trump is. Not that Trump is new, but I think people understand what Netanyahu's relationship to power in Israel goes back decades politically. Uh, so, I mean, yeah, looking at this in the sense of the division that's in Israel, I can't, imagine how this doesn't become the biggest issue in Israel going forward as they head to elections next year. When I was there a year ago, the biggest issue was Netanyahu's corruption. It wasn't the genocide in Gaza. It wasn't the continual annexation or the encroaching annexation of the West Bank. It wasn't even the hostages that were in Gaza. It was Netanyahu's corruption. And so, we could see that how this can continue to inflame things in Israel politically within its society, because there are clear dividing lines here. For the Palestinians, it doesn't matter. Those lines are all on the side that wants to see ethnic cleansing, continuation of genocide, and annexation. But to the response to Netanyahu's pardon request, I can't imagine Netanyahu would accept those terms. That seems anathema to who he is and why he's trying to get a pardon. So it's set up this showdown essentially, where you're going to have very much again like the United States, where we're anticipating these showdowns between, say, the Supreme Court and Donald Trump, whether or not Trump has bought off, or whether or not the Republicans on the Supreme Court are going to prove loyal to Trump. I think most of us think they will, but it's still an open question. And I think you have the same dynamics or spectacles soon to come in Israel.
I cannot imagine Israel without Netanyahu, because Netanyahu is becoming the identity of Israel. I don't know how is that possible, but he has been prime minister of Israel for such a long time.
Right.
And you have to talk with just Carl Wilkerson to remember Sharon,
I know, right?
Sharon is that far.
Right. I am old enough to remember when the Labor Party was a thing in Israel, but so like those names still ring a bell to me. But the reality is too, I'm also old enough to have known Netanyahu pretty much my entire adult life. Right. I mean, he was important in the early 90s. So this is a man whose role in Israel has been consequential for 3.5 decades, even longer. So the idea of Netanyahu leaving under such a mechanism as you basically have to ban. We'll give you a pardon, but you have to go into exile. That's against everything who that person is. It's just, unless he thinks he's Napoleon and he's going to come back from that exile, But that's not that's farcical or whatnot. But the idea of civil war in Israel is really not that far fetched. It's really not something that we could say, oh, that will never happen. I mean, certainly the indicators are there, the concerns are there. About a year ago, the head of the Shin Bet, which is Israel's equivalent roughly of the FBI or MI5, uh, he said his primary concern, his biggest fear, was Jewish terrorism. Right? Was this and then you look at the conduct of the Jewish settlers. Just listening today to Democracy Now, they had a woman on talking about the conduct of Israeli settlers towards Israeli Jewish citizens, and how that, where there once was somewhat of a line that separated how the Israeli settlers treated Palestinians from how they treated Israeli Jews, now that line is more or less gone. It's still more dangerous, as she said, to be a Palestinian, of course, but the idea that somehow Israeli settlers won't attack Israeli Jews that's gone. Israeli settlers have attacked Israeli soldiers. So for however many will get back out on the streets to protest Netanyahu, and remember, before October 7th, they had 1 million people in the streets at times protesting Netanyahu, and a population of 8 million, 9 million. That's amazing. It's massive. We have to remember, though, that there's an equivalent number of armed settlers who view those people who are on the streets protesting Netanyahu as traitors. And so the very real danger of some type of intrastate violence, whether you call it a civil war or not, in Israel, particularly with all the stresses of the last couple of years, the economic stress, plus, as we were saying earlier, the excesses that come from its colonization, the excesses that come from its attempts to dominate the region, from its apartheid and subjugation and genocide of the Palestinian people. Those all filter into society. And then those, of course, take root, and they blossom their own creations as well. Just again, this kind of, referencing, if you don't have a Donald Trump without some type of thing like a GWAT or a Patriot Act, and, bailing out the banks and all these other things. So, what's to come? I don't think there's speculation that we can say is too far-fetched.
Yeah. Matt, you mentioned the case of annexation. We know that the Trump administration said that annexation of the West Bank is impossible. He's not going to let that happen. But as we talk, we know that Israel is building barriers, walls to separate settlers from Palestinians in the West Bank. Somehow they're annexing the West Bank without officially being annexed. What is that? What should be a reaction? How do you consider a reaction from the United States to that? Because when you make a wall, when you separate, it means that you want to capture it. I don't see any other outcome.
Right. I think the Trump administration, like all preceding American administrations, will hide behind semantics. And so even though it's the occupied Palestinian territories, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Biden administration, the Clinton administration, et cetera, will dance around that word. They'll find other words to use. They will say things like, we don't agree with that assessment. And we've seen them do that continuously. I mean, look at all the reports, all the assessments, the number of organizations and states that were saying Israel is conducting a genocide, and the White House and State Department just saying, we don't agree with that. Even when they have their own people saying a genocide's being occurred, Israel's committing war crimes, Israel's deliberately starving the Palestinian people, all assessments that were provided to the White House or to, Tony Blinken at the State Department, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, they just simply said, we don't agree with that assessment, even when it came from their own people. So for the Trump administration to say, we're not going to support annexation, and just call annexation a different word, why wouldn't we think that would happen? And then for whoever follows the Trump administration, whether it's a Vance administration or a Rubio administration, or whoever on the Republican side, or if it's a Democrat administration, it's acceptance. So just as you had administrations for decades saying we will not support Israel's move of their we will not move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Trump did it, and then what did the Biden administration do? They just accepted it. So those types of things, you can see how it's just they'll just do as they did before. And you could also see, Nima, the willingness of the Trump administration to use wording and phrasing, or to acknowledge things clearly, that they are not de jure but de facto. And with the recent iterations of the peace plans that we've seen with regards to Ukraine and Russia, you see that with the Americans saying we're okay, de facto acknowledgement of Crimea, de facto acknowledgement of the Donbass, right? De facto acknowledgement of Zaporizhia and Kherson east of the river. Like this willingness to, what does legality matter to us? What do borders matter? What do conventions and statutes and agreements and laws matter to us? And again, so you see that reflection of in foreign policy, that of domestic policy as well. This is the administration, Nima, that is saying it's going to go to war in Venezuela through all its actions. And then because of narco terrorism, because Maduro is sitting at the top of a drug network that's killing tens of thousands of Americans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No evidence to support any of it, but they're saying it. And then what do they actually do? He pardons the guy who was running a drug network, convicted in a court in New York City, so they don't care about the reality. They just care that their people who need to hear such reasoning, such narrative, such excuses have it to work with, right? And they don't care what the rest of the world thinks. And they have a slim or a small care or concern for what the American people think. But primarily their messaging is going to be towards those who need some type of plausible deniability as to why they didn't have to think critically about the actions they were taking part in.
Matt, it seems that there will be a meeting in the southern part of Lebanon. Netanyahu was talking that Israel going to send a representative to that meeting. Have a representative from the government in Lebanon and Israel. It seems that, as I've learned just before coming up from the cradle, I've learned that it is the first time Israelis and Lebanese are talking directly to each other in that meeting. They're going to be that meeting, and
Right.
they're going to talk to each other. And the other, we have representative from France and from the United States. It seems to me somehow isolating the case of Lebanon, isolating the case of Syria, then is that going to help the situation in Gaza, in the West Bank? Because
No.
the main issue, because the conflict between Lebanon and Israel is because of Gaza, because of what's going on in the West Bank, mostly because of Gaza. And what is your take on that?
American and Israeli policy for decades, right, since Nasser, has been to break apart any type of unity in the Middle East, right, to make sure all these countries are kept in separate boxes. So to smash pan-Arabism, Arab nationalism, whatever you want to call it, and to isolate, and so to treat Syria differently than Lebanon, right, that these countries, although they are sovereign, that's not, so the emphasis is on their sovereignty as opposed to the aggressor in the region, right? The colonizer in the region, how they have one single minded, purposeful policy or plan throughout the region. Ignore that, but let's make sure all these separate countries are kept in their separate boxes, right? And that what's happening in Syria has nothing to do with what's happening in Libya, or sorry, what's happening in Lebanon, or what's happening in Iraq or in Libya. Like the idea, is to keep these things isolated. That distracts from the overall public and media understanding of American and Israeli policy. Oh, what's happening in Syria has got nothing to do with what's happening in Lebanon, as if, we're again pissing on our legs and telling us it's raining. But so that having that distraction, but then too, it also serves a purpose of making sure that none of these nations can support each other. None of these communities can support each other, right? So that mutual support. And that's, of course, what the axis of resistance intended to do. And, to the credit of American and Israeli strategy over the last couple of years, they've really been able to smash that, to break that apart, to break down that unity and make it so that these states and groups in the region cannot support each other against Israel. It's exactly what is, and the United States. I mean, I think it's always so important to make sure we're phrasing both of them, vocalizing that it's Israel, the United States, or the United States and Israel, that this is a conjoined policy. If you go to war against Israel, you're going to war against the United States as well. So, this idea of somehow trying to keep them separate is purposeful, and it's meant to ensure that there is an inability for these states and for these organizations and groups to work together. And then the idea of, if you can box off Syria and Lebanon, then who is going to provide any help at all to the Palestinians? I mean, you've taken away the ability of Iran as a fairly remote state from the issues of Palestine to provide support. You've diminished the ability of any Iraqi militias to be involved. Certainly, you have Jordan and Egypt as states that are of no threat whatsoever to the Israeli plans in Palestine. So this idea of getting to the point where you now have shaped or created the conditions so that there is no pressure on Israel coming from Lebanon or Syria, and most importantly, they can't provide any kind of support to Palestine. Well, that's exactly what the Israelis want, and this is why it's terrible to say, but even Gaza has always been a secondary effort. So you could have a genocide occur against the 2 million people, 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, and that was a secondary effort. That wasn't the main effort of the Israelis. The main effort is the West Bank. These can be considered shaping operations, right? I mean, secondary efforts. So, when you look at it that way, and then the other thing too is certainly the policy is not just to keep these people in boxes, keep these countries in their separate boxes, but then within those boxes to have chaos, to have instability, so that these boxes are unable. I'm sorry for calling these countries boxes, but these countries are then unable to organize any resistance against the Israelis and the Americans, and certainly not be able to work together against the Israelis and Americans. So you see the Americans and the Israelis going into Syria, Lebanon will include the French as well, with the purpose of getting these people fenced off and then basically causing havoc here, so that it's unstable, it's a mess. Part of these plans, of course, right, are to get buffer zones for the Israelis, so that the Israelis will have their buffer zone and then let the chaos, the instability, the fighting, whatever, occur on the other side of the buffer zone. The Israelis are happy with it. The Americans are happy with it. Their proxies in the region are happy with it because they think that they're gaining power, think that they're gaining, control, territory, what have you. But then, of course, it's the Palestinians who are suffering or put in an even worse, or put in an even worse position than they were before.
Matt, you've mentioned the situation with Venezuela. How do you see the way that Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth are talking about the bombing of that boat and then bombing the 2 survivors of the first attack? And we know that there is a lot of repercussions going on in the United States. It's not just about Democrats. We have Republicans coming out and talking about how illegal these sort of actions are on the part of the government in the United States. Here is Rand Paul talking about it.
It looks to me like they're trying to pin the blame on somebody else and not them. There's a very distinct statement was said on Sunday. Secretary Hegseth said he had no knowledge of this and it did not happen. It was fake news. It didn't happen. And then the next day from the podium of the White House, they're saying it did happen. So either he was lying to us on Sunday or he's incompetent and didn't know it had happened. Do we think there's any chance that on Sunday the Secretary of the Defense did not know there had been a second strike?
These are very important questions to ask, But I don't know if they have any sort of answer to these questions.
I think, to be glib, I think Hegseth is happy or lucky if he knows how much booze is left in the bottle, kind of thing. I'm not, basing my analysis on the assumption that a guy like Pete Hegseth has a good handle on what's occurring under his command or in his department. I am grateful for this conversation, for the dialogue that's going on in the media, at least in the United States, about laws of war, about the principles upon which we supposedly operate our armed services overseas. Now, of course, where is this conversation when the Obama administration was using drones not just to kill thousands of people, but to attack first responders? When the Obama administration was attacking funerals with drones deliberately, purposefully. Where is this conversation as 1,000, C-17 and C-5 air crews in the U.S. Air Force airlifted the weapons and munitions to Israel that Israel needed to carry out its genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza these last 2 years? A provision of weapons and support to Israel that violates 5 or 6 American laws. So where was this conversation? Where was this outrage? Where is this concern about law then? And that's important, because unless you understand the precedent that allows Donald Trump to carry out these actions, whatever you say or do about Donald Trump, if that precedent is not understood, and then the underlying foundational infrastructure and policies that allow for Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth and Admiral Bradley and so forth to carry out these types of drone strikes, well, if that's not all addressed, then you haven't touched not just the foundational reasons for these types of violations of the rule of law of law of war, but you're making sure that it's able to be conducted or carried out again. You're looking at all this. And the other thing I'll say too, Nima, is that I think the White House very adeptly put Admiral Bradley up front. And, just objectively looking at this, the White House did a good job, I think, out politicking their critics. So I think what the critics envisioned from Congress, including members of the Republican Party who have been against Pete Hegseth since his nomination. They wanted other people in there. They wanted people who really were part of the establishment, right? They wanted their loyalists to the arms industries, or they wanted, Palmer Luckey's cousin to take it over, or whoever, right? They wanted people who were part of the established interests regarding the national security state. Pete Hegseth, yeah, he was in the National Guard. He writes books about American machismo and things like that, about being a super patriot or whatever. But he's not the person that many in the national security establishment wanted for this position. So that's why you see a lot of Republicans seeing this may be a way to get Hegseth out. They also recognize him as incompetent and as an embarrassment. But here's an opportunity to get Hegseth out possibly and get one of our folks into that Secretary of Defense position. And that has backfired, I think, or may backfire, because none of these critics, whether in Congress or in the media, have the guts to take on a member of the military, right? So I think in their mind, they're visioning Pete Hegseth crumbling under withering interrogation in front of Senate and House Armed Service Committee hearings, possibly maybe even impeaching and removing Hegseth from office on this, and so they can see that. And we can see that. We can see Democrats as well as these Republicans who want Hegseth out carrying that out, going forward with a plan like that. However, now you're going to do that to an admiral, to a Navy SEAL, to a war hero, to a special operations veteran. I can't see members of Congress lining up to take that on. you know, as well as the media. Oh, aren't we supposed to salute the troops and thank them for their service? And aren't these our heroes? Aren't they all heroes? How can this admiral then have done something bad? You know, and so that I think is an aspect of this where it's not going to work for the critics of the administration, whether again in Congress or in the media, and that's unfortunate. That's terrible because that's exactly what you need. You need Admiral Cooper to be held to account just as much as you need, maybe even more than Hegseth, because Hegseth, again, no one is arguing about this guy's competence. No one is saying that this is a serious person there. But Cooper is, not sorry, Cooper, Bradley, Cooper's Central Command, but Bradley is serious. And Bradley represents that infrastructure. That Bradley represents the decades.
Admiral Bradley.
Admiral Bradley represents the decades of illegal warfare carried out by the United States. Admiral Bradley represents the precedent that Barack Obama established when he murdered American citizens with drones, right? When he, again, struck first responders, when he struck funerals, right? I mean, like, so that continuation, you know, of those policies of this mass extrajudicial assassination system that we have, that needs to be questioned, that needs to be examined, and that needs to be taken apart. And you do that by taking on somebody like Admiral Bradley instead of having some type of dog and pony show where hopefully you're going to get Pete Hegseth to break down and cry in front of the cameras. You know, I mean, so I think, you know, that's what we're seeing here is we're seeing politics with principles dressed around it instead of having principles with the politics around it.
Yeah. Matt, shifting the gear to Ukraine, do you understand this sort of attitude on the part of Ukrainian? Because they were talking about so far, the whole rhetoric of Europeans was that after Ukraine, they're going to attack us. Russia is preparing to attack Europe. And right now, they made these assumptions, and they're talking about, so we have to counter that sort of attack that they're going to do, they may do. We have to go with a preemptive attack on Russia and hybrid preemptive. What is that?
Yeah, I know, Nima. It's madness. It's absolute madness. It's one thing I just want to bring out because it irks me, and I'm sure it irks you and everybody watching, is the way the Western press talks about how these peace plans, particularly 28-point plan, and maybe it's now 27. And of course, there's a 19.1 from the Europeans, but the American one, how it was giving away everything to Russia, how it was, you know, meeting all of Russia's maximalist demands. I never heard the term maximalist in my life, except until a few years ago, you know. But anyway, now they use it all the time. But I thought Russia's intent was to conquer all of Ukraine and then to march on to Warsaw and Berlin and Paris. Isn't this the rationale behind why we have to be funding this war, why we have to be enabling this war, keeping this war going on? Because we don't fight the Russians in the Donbass, we'll be fighting them in the streets of Boston and Philadelphia and Miami. Wasn't that the rationale? And now you're telling me that, well, Putin's maximalist demands are two full provinces and the half of two others in eastern Ukraine. That's it. That's maximalist demands. You know, I mean, let alone the no requirement to get rid of Zelensky's government and put in a puppet of his own. You know, all these things we've heard for 4 years saying why we can't give up on Ukraine, why Ukraine's security is our security, how this is a battle of democracy versus autocracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and so I'm sure a lot of people have the same type of frustration seeing how the Western media and the politicians are so easy just to abandon a narrative for the sake of trying to ensure that nothing comes about with regards to ending this terrible, brutal, unwinnable war in Ukraine. But yeah, I mean, the madness then of the Europeans that we may have to, it's moved up. It's now, I think originally they were talking 2030, 2029 is when we'll have to go to war with Russia. I don't know. I might be confusing it with the crackpot realists here in the United States who keep giving us prediction as to when China is going to invade Taiwan. I mean, these are the same types of people, right? They come from the same camps. But there's this notion that by 2027, which is basically a year away at this point, we have to be prepared to fight Russia. And now, as you're saying, there are suggestions that we have to launch preemptive strikes. I mean, the desperation here goes beyond just the normal militarism. I don't want to say anything normal about militarism, but in the sense where militarism being utilized by European politicians over the last decade or so to distract from other problems within Europe, very serious, real problems, decline across the board, whatever metric you want to look at for Europe, but also and then larger societal issues as healthcare, immigration, housing, things like that. Trying to distract from those real serious consequential issues throughout Europe with the boogeyman of the Russian bear, or the new Hitler, or however they want to phrase it as. It's moved beyond that militarism to where politicians in Europe, whether it's the Germans, the Brits, the French, certainly those throughout the leadership of the EU, the Poles, now even the Scandinavians, God help us, the Baltics, they've always been this way, and for good reason. I'm not saying they shouldn't. If I was a Estonian or a Latvian, I would certainly have my feelings towards the Russians as well. But for those who are removed from that, who can have a degree of rationality or reason or proportionality to them, you see that their desperation to have a war with Russia, not even line Russia up as the boogeyman, the bad people who are going to come from the East, it's beyond that, to where they see that they need a war to maintain power, that things are so bad in Europe in terms of their unpopularity that in their desperation, they believe that a war is a way to maintain power. The idea being that this will prove not just themselves right or their leadership as being valid, but will be the mechanism through which their authority is cemented. This is really dangerous stuff, because the way they see it is that their self-interest is through war, right? And so that's a step beyond your garden variety militarism, which is bad enough. But when self-interest is deemed as being only protected or enabled through war, my God, God help us, right? God help us. Ursula von der Leyen, like I've said it before, and does anyone think that she doesn't go to sleep at night, thinking about becoming the first commander in chief of the European Union Army? And how do you get a European Union Army? Well, we need to go to war to get a European Union Army. I mean, you can start to see how that self-interest starts to make war seem like a rational decision.
Matt, what's amazing to me that I have never heard Putin coming out and responding to these. We had a lot of rhetorics during we are approaching 4 years of the conflict in Ukraine. We had a lot of changes, rhetorics coming out in terms of the escalation in Ukraine. But Putin came out and responded to European. He said that if you attack us, the response is not going to be what you're seeing in Ukraine. It's going to be totally different. We're going to respond in a different manner. What's amazing to me, that looking at the history of World War I and II, you see how people are inching toward a world war without noticing what's going on.
Yeah, well, first of all, that caution, if you will, because I don't want to call it a threat. I think it's more of a caution. Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, said to the Americans months ago, and Putin may have said something similar, but I know Lavrov did, that, look, if your concept that World War III would be fought in Europe, that the Europeans would be the buffer to protect America, which is how the Americans viewed it for decades, particularly during the Cold War. The idea being is that a nuclear confrontation will start off on the battlefields of Europe and then may expand to its cities, but by the time Birmingham is nuked, we will have been able to get this thing under control, and Washington, D.C. and New York and Chicago won't be harmed, right? That Europe is a buffer, just as the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians are a buffer in Asia. This is what empires do. They have buffers to protect their homeland. And so Sergei Lavrov said, if you think that's going to be the case, you're wrong. World War III will take place in the United States. I'm paraphrasing him. World War III will take place in the United States, just as it will in Europe. This parallel to World War I and World War II is, I think, instructive, and it's correct in many ways. And I look at the Treaty of Versailles, right? The peace settlement that ended World War I, and how that gave us World War II. How the desire by the Allies take, right, to punish, to have spoils, if you will, from particularly, say, the Germans, brought about the Germany of the 1930s and 1940s and made World War II inevitable. And there were people who were saying this at the time. I mean, no one, significant people, like John Maynard Keynes, right? I mean, he predicts that if you carry forward this Treaty of Versailles, if you carry out this punishment of Germany, we will have another war in Europe. And he was correct. And I think the parallel then is to the Cold War and the spoils of the Cold War, the way the United States treats Russia following its victory in the Cold War. And so the fact that just as you had after the First World War, the Allies punishing and looting Germany to a point that it wasn't just weakened, it was humiliated. The same thing occurs following the Cold War. You have the same type of entitlement that the Allies had following the First War. To the victor go the spoils. So you see that among the Americans, but then you have a looting of Russia, a humiliation of Russia, which gives you the Russia of today. The Russians speak about this themselves. I mean, this idea of Russia standing up for itself, whether you agree with it or not, it's what the Russians believe they are doing. The Russians look back at the 90s in horror, not because, as people will say here disingenuously in the US or in Europe, because the Soviet Union collapsed and they lost their empire. No, the Russians look back at that time in horror because of what it did to their people, of the gross impoverization of the people, the massive decline in quality of life, in the complete drop off in terms of life expectancy, of just the looting of the country, and then the what that created in terms of a criminal class, in terms of the oligarchs, and then overall just the humiliation. When you're in, say, Iraq or Afghanistan or Palestine, what you hear from those who are opposing occupation, what you hear from the resistance, in terms of the word that they use most to describe what they're enduring, is humiliation. And it's such a powerful thing that I don't think we in the West, particularly, as occupiers, colonizers, imperialists, as we, the ones who are doing the extracting and the exploiting, understand that shame that comes with being occupied, the shame that comes from being taken, right, of being looted from, of being powerless, and that humiliation that then, of course, leads into these, that is something that needs to be addressed. And so I think the humiliation of Germany following the First World War gives you the Second World War. And I think there's a good argument made that the humiliation of Russia following the end of the Cold War is what leads us here today in terms of war in Ukraine. I mean, there's other reasons for it, of course, one of those being the encroachment or encirclement of Russia by the United States, by NATO. But that itself is humiliation as well, let alone legitimate national security concerns.
Yeah. And I don't know if anybody, Matt, what you've just said is, I think it's so important to be considered by European leaders because they're part of that region. And in my opinion, if Donald Trump is willing to do something, which seems to me that he wants to do something with, he sent Steve Witkoff together with Kushner. We know that if Donald Trump sends Kushner to Russia, he may be serious about what he's doing. But what it's somehow it's absurd to me that Europeans are not there. Europeans are not, you know, there is no possibility of breaking a deal in Ukraine without Europeans being part of it. This is the problem. I don't know. The United States, the Trump administration feels you know, the the deep role of Europeans in any settlement in Ukraine, and how that could help the whole region for such, for the prosperity of the region.
Right, right. The Europeans, say they don't have anything to offer in this space other than spoiling it, right? That seems like the only leverage the Europeans are offering right now is spoiling any possible peace. That's it. And you said it so well, Nima, this idea that they could be providing something, some template, a roadmap for peace and then greater prosperity, a reemergence of Europe. Why the Europeans are not at this point convinced of the fact that they, in this multipolar world, could be a block that actually matters if they start to, right? If they start to prioritize those things that will make them actually strong, that will make them act, so start prioritizing your people, start rebuilding your educational institutions, start investing again in those commercial the commercial apparatus of Europe that dominated for centuries. I mean, you've got legacy corporations in Europe that are falling apart, that have been hollowed out. I mean, that all of this reality that Europeans have created because they have wanted to be first among the vassals of the American empire and still want to hold on to it. And you witness them over the last couple of years, whether it's the way they behave when they're in Donald Trump's presence, or whether it's the way they carry out things or do things, such as agreeing to that humiliating, use that phrase, humiliating trade and tariff deal this past year with the United States. Why, and then committed to this unwinnable war in Ukraine, rather than trying to find any other alternatives or any other avenues, not recognizing the power of up and coming associations like the BRICS. Is anyone here, anyone watching? If you do, please in the comments identify yourself. Does anyone here think that the EU is comparable at all to BRICS? And if I gave you $100 to invest in the EU or BRICS, which would you put your money into? Would anyone put that money into the EU? Right? And why is that? It's because the Europeans have chosen to pursue past glory. They've hitched their wagon to militarism. They have believed that for them, and this is where when you get into the political class, the rule, or maybe even larger than this, but especially the political class in Europe, the idea that our best bet is to maintain things as they are. Our power resides in the status quo. And the status quo means that we need to be the little fish swimming underneath the shark, right? The United States being, or the empire being that. And we need to be the little fish that gets the first nuggets that come out of that shark's mouth. I mean, that's essentially what you're looking at here with Europe for decades now, rather than, particularly say at the end of the Cold War, when they could have said, you know what? It's a new world order. We don't believe that being the vassals of this sole superpower is actually the best way for us. Sure, it's going to hurt in the short term. We're going to lose our status quo, lose our entitlements. It's going to make us uncomfortable for a while. However, the reality is that 10, 20 years from now, we could be the world leaders in education, technology. There's a lot of different ways the Europeans could have. Instead, they chose to go to war with the United States all through the Middle East. That brought about a surge of migration into Europe. That caused all kinds of societal conditions and problems and issues. And that has undermined their politics. That has made for governments that simply haven't governed, let alone planned. And so now you have a deindustrialized Europe that can't manufacture, can't export, can't make money. They don't have the world's reserve currency, so they can't be a successful importer of right. They don't have they don't have the strength of the United States when it comes to the backing of the dollar. So now they just see their budgets collapsing. their debt growing, their industries not, the industries stagnant. I mean, stagnating. Their industries are complete decline, and they have only themselves to blame for it. And the way for them, it seems to be, Nima, right? As we were saying, the way for them, or at least it seems for these political leaders, they believe the best thing for them is war. War gets us out of this. That's what I think many European leaders are thinking.
And the tragedy that you don't see any sort of alternative for these people in power.
No,
In the United Kingdom, I see no alternative for
we got reform.
Starmer. Who's gonna replace them that could somehow change the policies?
Right. I mean, look. I mean, I haven't looked at the UK polls in a few weeks now, so I might be off. But like, reform is polling at 30%. Nigel Farage is getting a third of the British electorate. Come on, really? I mean, like, and who they have to blame? Just themselves. Yeah,
exactly. Thank you so much, Matt, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thanks, Nima.